Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Dr. Paddy Gleeson, and I'm a lecturer in early medieval archaeology. And I'm going to talk to you about one of my main kind of research areas and research topics is archaeological approaches to understanding cult, religion, ritual, and essentially trying to reconstruct ways in which we can understand the belief systems of the past through the material evidence. So what I wanted to discuss firstly is, I suppose, the problems that are associated with quote unquote Celtic religion. This is probably something that many of you, at least people from an Irish background, are familiar with studies of early Ireland would probably be familiar with. It is an element of our popular culture and an element of indeed the national identity, that is quite commonplace. Certainly, I'm not particularly old, but when I was a primary school student, I recall being told the stories about Cuchulainn and the Knights of the Ulster Cycle and the Red Branch, as if it was history. However, much and all, as many of us might like to think that is the case, and Cuchulainn was a real person, the fact of the matter is that he probably wasn't, and much of what we now know as the corpus of mythology that we might ascribe to Celticism or call Celtic is not in any way connected with prehistoric religion or pre-Christian belief in Ireland. There's many issues associated with the use of that material to reconstruct belief cosmology in the past, and those are the sorts of issues, I suppose, that I want to address with this brief talk. So firstly, the big issue that we have in many respects with regards to Celticism and Celtic is the idea of Celtic itself. So essentially, there is a kind of, I suppose, a long historiography associated with this. But popular, at least up until very recently, it was kind of taken for granted that material culture change that we see in the Iron Age in Ireland could legitimately be associated with Celtic migrations. Therefore, once we get into the Roman period, the absence of a Roman conquest of northern Britain, i.e. parts of Scotland and Ireland, means that essentially Celtic ways of life and Celtic culture persisted there when they didn't or weren't kind of corrupted in other regions of Europe like Gaul or southern Britain, etc. Now, that is incredibly problematic, not only because scholars have come to realise in recent decades the degree to which societies outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire were influenced by the Roman Empire itself and could adopt and adapt ideas and certain social norms. Also because, I suppose, it's problematised the ways in which we think about what we mean by Celtic too. So if we concentrated particularly on Ireland, I suppose when we talk about Celtic myth and Celtic mythology, essentially what we're talking about is quite an eclectic bunch of sources and textual sources at that. The idea that Rome never conquered Ireland or never conquered the so-called Celtic region of Ireland and northern Scotland allowed, probably up until the mid to late 20th century, a perception to persist that essentially an oral society, the oral traditions of a prehistoric society, could come to be preserved in the textual sources and the documentary sources that come down to us today from early Christian Ireland, from the early medieval period in Ireland, so essentially from the 7th century onwards. And so when we talk about Celtic myth and mythology, these are the different types of sources that we're actually talking about. We're talking about annals and chronicles, which originally were entries in perhaps Ulster or in Easter, tables for the calculation of Easter, kind of records of annual events, probably not composed contemporaneously in Ireland up until the late 6th century. Alongside chronicles, we're talking about literature. Those are the Cycle of Kings, the Ulster Cycle, etc. But that body of literature is a whole host of different types of evidence. It is heroic literature. The Táin, for instance, a very famous example, the kind of Irish version of things like Beowulf, but also political commentaries on successful dynasties, etc. We also have what we might call hagiography, and this is essentially saints' lives, texts about the achievements of saints and different ecclesiastical figures that encounter, for instance, the pre-Christian world and pre-Christian society in Ireland. So famously in hagiography of St. Patrick, he encounters the Druids and has battles with the Druids, etc. We also have sources like place names that we can think about in terms of what they might mean about people's beliefs associated with particular places. So, for instance, in another taster video that I've done, Lagore Crannog, the place name Lagore comes from Lake of the Two White Mares, which is a reference to a kind of a sovereignty goddess ideal, where the sovereignty goddess is personified by white horses in certain rituals. Likewise, the social structure, the kind of character of prehistoric society in Celtic regions is often recomposed and reconstructed from things like the law tracts, status tracts particularly, which give us a very kind of detailed insight into the structure of society and the status associated with different categories of society. The problem with all this is that all of this literature dates from the 7th to 17th century. It spans a millennium, but none of it can be concretely shown to predate 600 AD, shall we say, so after the coming of Christianity. By and large, the earliest literature that we have surviving today in any sort of these categories probably comes from the mid to late 7th century, and some of the sources that we regard as appropriate to this corpus of myth, in inverted commas, are as late as the 17th century in the case of things like the Annals of the Four Masters. They're eclectic sources that have been redrawn, redacted, composed and reimagined in various different ways by various scholars, and not just modern scholars, also scholars of the medieval world in the medieval world. So, for instance, it is common when we have texts from the historic period to have multiple redactions of those texts. Take, for instance, a text associated with the kings of Cashel and the founder of Cashel, Conall and the Kirk of Ligda. There's also a whole host of texts associated with the finding of Cashel, called the Finding of Cashel and the Exile of Conall. These probably span the 7th to the 9th or even 10th centuries AD, but they come down to us in manuscripts that are much, much later, and they come down to us in redactions and versions of those texts that could be 7th or 8th centuries AD in date, or could be 9th or 10th centuries AD in date. We can also use folklore, I suppose, and folklore has been used, but this is a problematic source in many ways. We can't use this uncritically, and we can't expect it to have any more validity or any less problems than the problems caused by the lateness of many of the sources that we use in that idea of myth when we try and reconstruct an idea of Celtic myth through using all of these sources eclectically together. Now, to give us an idea of how this has been used, that idea of Ireland, essentially, its literary corpus, preserving Celtic oral traditions from prehistory because unconquered by Rome, is probably one of the reasons that Ireland is seen as this kind of last outpost of Celtic society. Particularly, the same sort of idea has permeated, I suppose, the use and abuse in many ways of Welsh and to a lesser degree Scottish sources, because Wales was maybe not as Romanised as other regions of Britain. So texts like the Mabinogion, texts like the Gododin, famous heroic texts in a kind of a Brittonic context, being used alongside literature sources from Ireland to reconstruct ideas of how society worked in, say, the pre-Roman Iron Age. Famously, this was done very successfully by Barry Cunliffe, who used status tracts to understand the shape and kind of nature of settlement and activity in somewhere like Danebury. And this is, I suppose, a sort of a facet of understanding of pre-Roman society in Britain that is relatively common, even if not very explicit in recent sources. Much of this owes a lot to a study published in the mid-20th century by Kenneth Jackson. And Kenneth Jackson's study was really a formative study. He, I suppose, pioneered an idea that essentially the Irish and Welsh sources were a window on the Iron Age, that they preserved an oral tradition, a culture that is prehistoric in origin and existed very much unchanged right into the historic period. So, for instance, the idea that some of the sources that we use, like in Barry Cunliffe's ideas about Danebury, could be used to understand pre-Christian society because they were set down from an oral tradition largely unchanged. This is very similar to an idea that was kind of developed on the continent to do with migration period societies and understanding ideas about ethnicity called traditions kernel. That essentially a kernel of tradition was maintained by elites, a kind of an oral tradition and identity that was preserved into kind of a historic periods. So in many ways, Jackson's idea was this idea that the oral tradition of prehistoric society was preserved in a kernel of Celtic tradition that was maintained and preserved in early Christian texts. But I suppose that means we need to think about the agendas governing the ways in which our corpus of mythology, again in inverted commas, comes from and what it's intended to produce. Mm-hmm. So mythology isn't a corpus of literature or a genre of literature that existed in the medieval world. It's not something that people thought about. The manuscripts that we have, as I've already said, they come from much, much later than the periods within which they describe or refer to. They do not, for instance, come from the prehistoric period, from the late Iron Age. They come from a Christian society and a Christian period. They were set down, written by monks, redacted by monks various times, and for the most part, the manuscripts within which these texts survive might be 12th, 13th, 14th, even 15th and 16th centuries in origins and date. So what we have in those texts are texts that might originate in the 7th and 8th centuries, but which have been rewritten, copied, and produced in manuscripts that survive much, much later. So there's a whole host of issues associated with this. As I said, the earliest surviving literature in Ireland is probably 7th century AD in date, but most commonly it only survives as a much, much later copy, with various redactions and various versions of the stories that differ. And interestingly, increasingly we've appreciated that the ways in which those stories differ tell us about the agendas, the propaganda, and the political context within which they were produced and copied. So, for instance, a monk composing a source might decide to flatter a dynasty who trace descent from an important individual, or who trace descent from a heroic person, and they might adapt that to fit current circumstances. So they might change the role of a person in a story, etc. Likewise, if we think about lots of the sources that we might use in an understanding of Celtic mythology, annals are not history, as I said. They are actually notes in calculations for Easter. They're not intended to be objective history in the sense that we think of it. In actual fact, history as a kind of a modern idea of it never really existed in the medieval period. What we understand as mythology was regarded as history in a very classical sense. It's not regarded as a very objective account of what happened in the past. Likewise, hagiography was equally a political propaganda exercise. It was about making links between saints and important ancestors for dynasties that ruled in, say, the 8th, 9th or 10th centuries, like the Aeneid. So creating links between the ancestors of those dynasties or the various successful lineages and the saints who populate hagiography. Likewise, an underlying function of these texts was what we might call allegory and exegesis. It wasn't to relate historical stories that actually occurred. It was to provide commentaries on morals and on the meaning of life, etc. So people started to react to that, particularly in historical and comparative literature studies, particularly in Ireland, or focusing on studies of Ireland, probably mostly from the kind of 1950s onwards, but increasingly from the 1980s, there was a massive growth in what was called revisionism, reacting against what was called nativist scholarship, the kind of the nativists adopting a stance where essentially the pre-Christian elements or tropes within this body of literature were legitimate and could be identified, and then the revisionists or the anti-nativists arguing that actually the clerical agendas, the ecclesiastical agendas were redolent in these texts and they couldn't be accepted uncritically. Some of the leaders in that field were people, famous, brilliant historians like people like Donegal Caron and Liam Brannock, Kim McCone. These people produced studies and entire books that really problematized the agendas underpinning many of these texts. So some of the things that they showed were not only that biblical exegesis and allegory and even biblical stories could underlie or provide the template for heroic stories or saga or mythology, but also that actually some of the seemingly most archaic passages that survive and come down to us from the corpus of literature, passages of archaic, intentionally archaic and obscure sayings called Roscad, that they aren't actually unbiased, unaffected oral passages, but actually some could even directly translate biblical passages. So if that is the case, then we have to allow that the vast majority of literature that comes down to us from the medieval period is not, if not entirely, then by a large part, actively shaped in the medieval period and reshaped if it does indeed have any sort of pre-Christian or prehistoric element to it. So we don't have then, if that is the case, in our corpus of literature and literary sources, an oral tradition from later prehistory, a kind of an unbroken chain of transmission from prehistoric society. What we actually have is a very actively shaped, very intentionally learned creation of early Christian Ireland, conducted and successfully manufactured by early Christian monks. One of the major studies in that regard is actually by an emeritus professor of archaeology here at Queen's, Professor James Mallory, who has a huge amount of literature and scholarship under his belt on exactly this aspect. But one of the seminal pieces of work that Jim conducted was actually to show that the world of Cuchulainn in texts like the Táin Bó Cúailnge, that the material culture described, the swords, the shields, etc., the spears, they describe not Iron Age material from the Celtic world or from Ireland and Scotland, but actually they describe early medieval material culture. That the monks that composed and redacted and set down in text these stories, that they used the props of their worlds, of their medieval Christian worlds, to populate the stories and the texts that they analysed. In particular, a lot of the material culture actually belongs in the Viking Age, so the very, very end of the early medieval period, rather than in maybe the post-Roman periods in the 5th, 6th or 7th centuries. So the texts themselves are clearly being actively shaped by early Christian monks. And so, not to be too pessimistic, but they probably tell us very, very little about Celtic society or about pre-Christian society in later prehistoric Ireland. So if that is the case, of course, then we're back to a situation where we can wonder, well, what actually can we say about pre-Christian religion in early Ireland, about the religion of Celtic society? And that is actually an incredibly difficult issue. It is one that we can probably at the moment say very, very little, although there is probably a degree of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of developing ways in which we can access people's beliefs and understandings of their cosmological systems and worldviews. But what I wanted to do for the rest of this talk is to build on that idea that actually the world of pre-Christian Ireland, as it comes down to us in the text, is an active commentary on medieval society and the shaping of medieval society, populated with medieval material culture and the concerns of society, by looking at some particular places that are associated with pre-Christian deities, pre-Christian figures, in both place names and texts. So if we were to try and develop an understanding of Celtic religion, if the texts are not as useful as we've often allowed, if the texts are as problematic as has been identified in recent decades, then how can we understand pre-Christian religion? And the answer must be archaeology. We must be able to develop an understanding of religion based on the material evidence that is materially led. It is based on the stuff that people used, the places they created, and the worldviews that they manufactured through that nexus between human imagination and the material world. Famously, that is not an easy task for archaeologists, and it is one that has long been identified as the most difficult element of archaeological analysis and inference. Famously, for instance, Christopher Hawkes produced a ladder of inference in which religion and belief occupied the highest, least accessible rung of his approach. But I would argue that actually we can identify an archaeology of religion, but it is one that's centered around religious transformation. And really what I mean there is that we should be able to approach this issue through looking at the ways in which people engage with the material world and how that material world changes as it reflects changing ideas of ritual, belief, cosmology, and cult. Of course, those terms, ritual, belief, cosmology, and cult, they're terms that have been problematized and can be debated, but I think they're yet applicable. Belief refers to the worldview, the cosmology of people. Ritual is a kind of barometer for how people construct that worldview and engage with it. And cult is the recognition of kind of exceptional activities or exceptional places. So if we can recognize ritual in the material record, one of the kind of mainstays of archaeological analysis, then why not regard ritual change as a barometer for religious transformation? So I think the way forward is actually quite positive for archaeology, and we can construct an archaeology of Celtic religion, an understanding of Celtic religion based on material evidence and not beholden to the text. And that is quite an exciting way forward for us, but it has yet to be done very systematically. In one way, the kind of key areas that we could identify as the kind of linchpins for that are the built environment, the places of ritual and religion that people constructed, and the ways in which that built environment engages with their understanding and developing understandings of the natural world and how it affects the natural world. So, for instance, the ecological effect of religious transformation. Likewise, looking at things like the mortuary sphere to see how people's engagements with burial, belief, and death change through time. And recognising that in material culture we have a source of evidence that we can engage with to understand cosmology, belief and ritual in ways that we probably haven't been able to access until very recently. So as a way into thinking about this, rather than looking at late prehistoric religion and ritual, I want to focus specifically on ideas associated with deities and places of cult and religious activity in the medieval period, and from within a kind of Christianizing context and Christianizing society, to understand, alongside the kind of critiques of the historical sources in Celtic mythology that I've outlined previously, how we could actually get to a situation where we might actually have the creation of the pantheon of Celtic gods that we often assumed populated the pre-Christian world, but actually within a Christian society of the early medieval period. An interesting place to start there is Brunaboyne, the Bend of the Boyne Cemetery, probably most famous and commonly known to all of you because of the great passage tombs of Doubt and Knout, but also Newgrange. Famous internationally, I suppose, because they're incredibly sophisticated monuments aligned on the solstice in the case of Newgrange, and incredibly popular as a tourist destination, as both a World Heritage designated site and also as an incredibly significant ritual landscape from the Neolithic period in Ireland. I won't talk about the Neolithic or the prehistoric elements. I want to focus specifically on what happens in this landscape in the medieval period, how it changes and how those passage tombs are used in the medieval period. So famously, I suppose the Brunaboyne is a place that is implicated in a lot of early Irish myths. It is associated in stories with Cuchulainn, with lots of the gods and deities associated with the Bend of the Boyne Cemetery. Famously, Newgrange is associated with Lu, the kind of god of the sun and god of kind of kingship in many respects in terms of traditional understandings of Celtic religion. But equally, as much as Lu is associated with Newgrange, Knout is an equally fascinating monument because in Old Irish, in the early medieval period, Knout was Cnogba, Cnogba. And that comes from Cnogbuí, which means the yellow hill, but also where Bui, yellow, is a pseudonym or a name for a sovereignty goddess, a sovereignty figure, synonymous with, for instance, the Cailleach, or the Cailleach Beara, the Hag of Beara. In the medieval period, the Bend of the Boyne Cemetery was a royal landscape. It was a place of kingship. Most famously, of course, in the case of Knowth, because Knowth was actually a place of kingship. It was a royal seat. It had kings. There was a king of Knowth, and the kingdom ruled by the kings of Knowth probably approximates, at least in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, to Northern Brega, which in modern speak is probably Northern County Meath, Southern County Louth and Northern County Dublin. Knockba, Knowth, is an incredibly interesting monument in itself, but how it develops in the early medieval period is extraordinarily fascinating. In the late Iron Age, there's a small amount of evidence for activity at Newgrange, further to the east, where we have a whole host of very exotic, very exquisite material, high-status exotic objects, deposited in proximity to the entrance into the passage tombs. The passage tomb of Newgrange itself. A lot of this material is imported Roman material, a lot of it is gold, but it's not deposited in the tomb itself. It's deposited in proximity to the entrance, suggesting that people knew where the entrance was, but also perhaps that they venerated that entrance. Possibly this is, and it has been suggested by a range of different scholars, that this is actually evidence of a shrine or a tomb. So for instance, Cathy Swift, Ryan Lafloyne have all suggested this is evidence for a kind of a Romano-British style shrine associated with that tomb. We have a limited amount of evidence for contemporaneous activity in the late Roman Iron Age, so the 1st to 5th centuries AD at Knowth, in artefactual evidence that's comes from excavations conducted by George Ogan. But it's really in the 5th to 7th centuries that we get a little bit more concrete evidence. And in the 5th and 7th centuries, we have a whole host of different artefacts found in the excavations that also seem to have been deposited from their find spots in proximity to the entrances into the Great Passage Tomb of Knowth. Now you can see the Great Passage Tomb on the image on the top right. And the first thing that will strike you is hopefully that there is a huge mound, the major passage tomb of Knowth, at the centre of the image. But that mound is actually surrounded by a whole host of satellite tombs. Now these are fascinating because these satellite tombs are all, of course, Neolithic passage tombs, smaller versions in essence of what Knowth is itself, but also because of how this whole complex is reused in the medieval period. If you look at the image on the bottom left, you'll see Knowth in the kind of centre right of the image, with some of the satellite tombs visible too, but you'll also see Slane on the top left-hand side of the image. And Slane is, of course, a very important ecclesiastical site. It features in patrician hagiography, but it also is associated with some of the royal dynasty, some sections of the royal dynasty of the Síl Line, associated with the kingship of Brega, the kingship of Northern Brega, and the kingship of Knowth itself too. So whatever happens at Knowth, that context of having a very close ecclesiastical site associated with members of the royal dynasty is incredibly significant. So if we look at Knowth, what we have at Knowth in the early medieval period, aside from the artefactual evidence that might suggest some sort of ritual activity associated with the passage tombs, the deposition of things like those penannular brooches you can see on the bottom right-hand side of the image in proximity to the entrances into those passages. When we get into the 7th century, things change because we see two major structural constructional phases at Knowth in the early medieval period. The first is a 7th to 9th century phase, and it consists of the digging of two ditches and an early medieval cemetery. The 9th to 12th centuries is very different. We see a whole host of buildings, we see a whole host of souterrains. They're underground tunnels, perhaps used for storage or refuge. The first phase of activity, the 7th to 8th century phase of burial, is really, really fascinating. Because what we see in this period is that the satellite tombs around the Great Passage Tomb of Knowth, they actually are reactivated. They're activated and used as monuments in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, when some of them are completely remodeled or substantially changed and reconstructed. Some of them are actually used as burial chambers. The vaults are opened up and burials are inserted into the satellite passage tombs. Likewise, we see a whole host of burials, particularly around the southwest of the passage tomb mound, come to be deposited in open graves and stone-lined cists around the mound. So actually what we're seeing is the creation of a cemetery associated with these prehistoric monuments in the 7th centuries and continuing perhaps as late as the early 9th centuries. So this is really fascinating, but probably given the context of Naut as a royal site, these are actually probably royal burials. These are the stirps regia, the royal lineage of Síl de Sláine, the kings who ruled from Naut and are associated with Naut and Slane in documentary sources. But when we get into the early 8th century, we see the first major constructional phase, or alteration of the mound itself. Now, when Naut was excavated in the latter half of the 20th century, when it was excavated, it was initially thought from the evidence of the burials that there was an Iron Age phase here, but it was quickly recognised that actually it was an early medieval phase. And the mound itself had been significantly altered at some point in the early 8th century, and the excavator George Ogan very, very justifiably identified this as a ring fort, essentially an early medieval residential enclosure of a kind of nucleated family style, very common throughout the landscape of Ireland. There's about 80,000 of them surviving or 60,000 of them, surviving in the landscape of Ireland today. However, I would very respectfully disagree with that, not only because there wasn't very conventional evidence of habitation found on the crest of the Great Passage Tomb. There wasn't, for instance, houses found. That could be because of a range of disturbance and quarrying activity. But also, it might be because it just isn't there. One of the characteristic features of a ring fort is a whole host of ditches associated with defining that actual ring fort. But what we can see on the screen is that while the outer ditch has a very marked V-shaped profile that is characteristic of a ditch, we can see somebody standing in that ditch as it's being excavated. We can also see that the inner ditch, the second ditch of that enclosure, is much more like an L-shaped profile. It's not U-shaped or V-shaped. And I don't think that really is evidence of a ring fort. I think that actually what we have here is the creation of a stepped mound, the creation of a very, very special monument. The L-shaped profile of the ditch on the inner part of that mound essentially created a large step cut into the side of the crest of that mound that changed the way it was viewed and could be interacted with. There was a causeway left undug in a part of the right-hand side of the screen so that you could access the top of the mound. And I would suggest that actually what was being created slightly after the cemetery had been developed in the satellite passage tombs around the mound is actually a stepped mound to be used as a place of assembly for the wider kingdom, and also perhaps inauguration, a place where the king was inaugurated at the start of his reign. One of the reasons for that is that alongside the absence of evidence for occupation in terms of houses, etc., on the crest of the mound, at the point at which that stepped mound was created in the 8th century, the tombs of the Great Passage Tomb, the passages of the Great Passage Tomb of Naut were actually entered, and a whole host of inscriptions were inscribed in the orthostats of the Passage Tomb chamber. You can see some of these on the screen here. These inscriptions were both in insular script, so in the kind of script that you can recognise on the top right, as well as in Ogham. Now, Ogham is a form of inscription applied to stone generally in Ireland between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, but these are different. These are slightly later. These are 8th or 9th centuries AD and date, both the inscriptions in insular script and in Ogham. And they're very, very different to what we get earlier. They're also much, much more obscure. So the names of the people that are being commemorated in these inscriptions, because it is all names, it's of particular people, they're not normal names. They're not the kinds of names associated with either the people, the Síl de Sláine, who ruled from Naut, or found commonly in the corpus of genealogies or names associated with the dynasty or the people of early medieval Ireland. They're very uncommon names with very unusual elements. So, for instance, Temtanoch, that you could see on the top right, this has a root. Tem is very similar to Tara or to Temenus, to temple, the same root in modern English that means a sacred space, someone cut off and demarcated. The intentionally obscure nature of these inscriptions would lead me to suggest that actually what we have here is the creation of mythical figures, the creation of important ancestors, and the invention of those mythical figures too. I don't think it's any coincidence that actually what we see here is contemporary with the creation of a stepped mound. I think that what's happening here is that we're seeing the creation of a very elaborate inauguration ritual. On the one hand, the use of an existing cemetery to create a stepped mound to be used for inauguration and assembly, and the entrance into those chambers associated with that mound to create myths, to create mythical figures, like perhaps Bui, this goddess associated with Naut and implicated in the place name Knockba itself, that we might actually have in these activities the invention of that figure, the creation of the mythology associated with her in the 8th century AD. The location of the inscriptions is really interesting in this case because they're at highly visible portions of the chambers. They're along the orthostats that are visible as you process up the chamber, but they're also in very important parts about the chambers at the very end of the passage tomb itself. So they're very selective and they're very, very carefully positioned. So I would suggest that actually what we have in the case of Naut is the invention of a goddess or a sovereignty figure that we would conventionally associate with Celtic myth and assume to be a kind of a prehistoric element of cosmology that survives in the later corpus of literature. I don't think that is the case. I think we can actually see in the mid-8th century that person being created. Another example, and where I'll leave it, of where I think we can see this, is actually my hometown. I'm from a place called Nina. One of the reasons I became an archaeologist and so interested in royal and kingship places is because Nina comes from Éanach. That's what the modern English name Nina comes from, Untainach, the assembly place or the Éanach place. And Éanach was the principal assembly place of each kingdom in medieval Ireland, or each level of kingdom in medieval Ireland. Nina was a particularly important place. Nina was the assembly place of East Munster, so more or less kind of modern day counties, Tipperary, Kilkenny, etc. That was kind of the region that it was the assembly place for. Now, there's been some really interesting excavations as a part of road schemes in and around Nina in recent years that probably provide an insight into the nature of that assembly place. Before we go into looking at those, though, it's interesting to think that Nina, as the Éanach or assembly place of East Munster, is only documented as the assembly place of East Munster in the 11th and 12th centuries. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Nina is referred to as Éanach Teda, the assembly place of Teda, where Teda is identified as this mythical female in whose honour the assembly games were convened after she died and was buried in an assembly mound. Now that's very, very fascinating when we come to look at the assembly landscape. So you'll note from the map on the right hand side, it's giving you an insight into the location of a townland of Tullaheedy that we'll discuss, as well as Carrigatoher, which is an important cemetery, and Knockempearson Nina North, which are two other very important cemetery sites or burial places in the vicinity of Nina. Carrigatoher Harding first is a really fascinating place to look at. This is what's called a cemetery settlement, and essentially it's a site that has a cemetery component centrally positioned within it and a whole host of enclosures that enclosed a whole series of different activity areas or zones. Now, the graves in the cemetery element is limited to a key element of the centre of the site, but they're not extending out into the wider hinterland of the enclosures themselves. These sorts of sites are often associated with crop processing, metalworking, other kind of production activities. It's very unusual to find domestic evidence in these sites. It's very unusual to find, for instance, houses that people lived in, although in this case we do have a rectangular structure just outside the entrance into the cemetery. And this is a very unusual rectangular structure because part of the structure is built with post holes and part of it is actually built with a slot trench for upright kind of timbers stuck into the ground. So it's a kind of composite building. In that regard, it's probably significant that it's positioned immediately outside the entrance into the cemetery itself. So that's kind of by the by to a certain degree. But what we have at Carrigatoher Harding is probably a cemetery settlement site, so a site used for burial and for a whole host of different activities, that was actually used as an assembly place for a lineage or a tuha in early medieval Ireland. And I've written a whole host of articles outlining the reasons for this that you can find online. So Carrigatoher Harding is probably a very early assembly place associated with the broader assembly landscape of Nina. It's only in use though from the 5th to 8th centuries AD in date. It's focused on a knoll, which is very fascinating. The cemetery itself developed around the knoll, possibly because that was mistaken for a mound. And the primary burial, the earliest burial of the site, was actually inserted into that knoll, suggesting that it was in fact mistaken for a mound and identified as a prehistoric burial place that this cemetery developed around. Even more interestingly, and in favour of it being identified as an assembly place, is the fact that the name Carrigatoher comes from Stone of the Rootway. That probably refers to the Toher, or the Rootway, being the Schleedall, or the road of assemblies that essentially connected modern days Dublin and Limerick and ran through Nenagh, which is the reason the modern M7 and the road scheme identified this site in the first place. But activity ends at Carrigatoher Harding in the 8th century AD. But at the point at which Carrigatoher Harding actually falls out of use, activity starts very nearby at Tullaheedy. Now, Tullaheedy is a really fascinating site because at Tullaheedy there was an incredibly important Neolithic site excavated also as a part of the road schemes. And it seemed to be, axe factory is probably a poor word to use for it, but it seemed to be a kind of a redistributive centre for the importation, manufacturing of axes and the redistribution of those axes around North Munster in the Neolithic period. Now, while that's kind of outside of my interest in terms of the medieval activity here, it is interesting to think about the possibility that because there was hundreds of axes found at this site during excavation, it's very, very likely that when medieval activity occurred at this site, people would have found those objects. They would have encountered those stone axes and might have interpreted them as relics of the past, as kind of charged objects that could be used, for instance, in some sort of mythical way in storytelling, etc. You can see from some of the images on the right what the site looked like before and during excavation. So before excavation is on the bottom centre of the image, and then during excavation is on the top right. What I'm interested in, though, is that during the 8th century AD, we see, at the point at which Carrigatoher Harding is going out of use, we see the construction of a ditch around the gravel knoll of Tullaheedy, with the effect of creating a mound, manufacturing a mound, creating a mound by the construction of that ditch. Very similar to what we see at Knout. That there's a connection between these might be suggested by the fact that at the same point as that ditch is being constructed around Tullaheedy to create a mound, the ditches at Carrigatoher Harding are actually backfilled. The bank's material is pushed into the ditch to fill up the ditches, ritually decommissioning the site. And what we see is activity shifting to Tullaheedy, where we also start to see evidence of feasting, large gatherings of people, perhaps suggesting that the assembly place moved from Carrigatoher Harding to Tullaheedy. One of the reasons for that is evidence of things like cooking pits, so lots and lots of evidence for production of food, and then feasting remains associated with the site at Tullaheedy, as well as large numbers of horn stones deposited in the ditches that would have been used for sharpening swords, etc. So possibly what we actually have at Tullaheedy is the manufacturing of a mound in the 8th century as one site goes out of use. And I would suggest that that is very relevant in terms of thinking about the place name Tullaheedy. Tullaheedy probably comes from Tulloch Teda, where Tulloch means hill or mound or mountain, where Teda is the mythical female ancestress in whose honour the Éanach Assembly Games of Nenagh were supposedly created and manufactured. So what we possibly have here is, like Knout, the invention of a mound in the 8th century AD to be connected with the invention of a mythical female sovereignty figure associated with that assembly place or that royal place, etc. That here again, like at Knout, we have the creation of a goddess in early Irish tradition, but not a goddess of the prehistoric past. In the 8th century, we see a Christian society creating a goddess that we have, up until very recently, assumed was a goddess of the pre-Christian past, the prehistoric past, rather than being a learned invention and fiction, as most probably Teda and Bui or the Hag of Beara are in medieval tradition at Knout and Tullaheedy. I think that's what we can see here in the case of Tullaheedy. So this mound of Teda, this Tulloch Teda, we could probably justifiably assume is a monument that's been created to bring together the peoples of East Munster as this assembly place is invested with significance as a regional assembly place for the region of East Munster. Teda, of course, was then a kind of a mythical ancestress of lots of the peoples or the lineages and dynasties of East Munster. The ditch being constructed around the knoll in around about 730 to 780 is relatively closely dated, like the one at Knout. So I think we're starting to see a pattern here where we can see feasting evidence associated with the creation of an assembly place, but invested in surrounding an assembly mound associated with a mythical figure, a mythical ancestress. So to end then, I think what hopefully that talk has shown is that our basis for understanding Celtic religion based on textual sources is probably very flawed. Lots of the kind of popular ideas we have about the pre-Christian past, about later prehistory that comes from textual sources, documentary sources, etc., can be very, very problematic. But now we can recognise that not only are those sources created actively and shaped in the medieval period, but that maybe some of the cosmological importances of them, the figures that populate those texts, the mythical females, the gods, goddesses, etc., that they were actively created in the medieval period, with monuments associated with them being consciously created by a Christian society, for instance, in the case of the Mound at Knout, or in the case of Tullahedy. Why they would do that is another question. That's probably the subject of a talk that we could do at another time. But it highlights the need for archaeology to engage much more systematically with developing an empirically led, materially centred account of religion, belief and ritual for the prehistoric past. If we were to actually understand what Celtic belief was like and what Celtic religion was actually like, then we need to do so based on the archaeology of later prehistoric Ireland and other regions. The archaeology of later Iron Age Ireland and other regions, not on the basis of later textual sources. So that's where I'll leave you. Textual sources. So that's where I'll leave you. Thanks very much for listening.